the party. So it's so important that we start off with a common understanding of what our values and principles are. And particularly just looking at the current context in the country, we are in an environment where many leaders, where there's corruption, where there's elite enrichment, where there, people govern with impunity. And so although they may seem quite ordinary principles of any political party, it actually is important that you have a party committing itself to values like accountability, to transparency, and to redress that is targeted towards the majority of South Africans.
The sound has got very soft.
That's what the first day of the conference was about, to kind of set out who we are as a party and organization and the kind of values and principles that will inform the policies that we develop as an offer to South Africa. Then on the second day, the principal document that was being discussed was the economic justice policy. This policy primarily is our response to the problem of economic exclusion, very much confronting the fact that after 2 decades of ostensibly a democratic South Africa, the majority of Black South Africans still find themselves excluded from the economy. And we approached it from saying, kind of everyday analysis, or the analysis that some would like to try and lead us towards, is the analysis that says that the single reason for why there is economic exclusion in this country is because of white monopoly capital. And we think that this continued reliance on this kind of racial division is problematic for our country, and that if we can achieve 2 noble goals, ostensibly to achieve redress or economic inclusion, and also be able to push forward with the initial democratic dream of a non-racial South Africa, why would we not want to do both? And so this policy starts off with those 2 very ambitious aims: to create an empowerment policy for the country that both is informed by non-racialism and to address the challenge of economic exclusion. And what this policy offers is that it says, what are the drivers of economic exclusion? Because it's so important that any policy worth its salt must identify what are the factors that drive economic exclusion in the country, and then that policy must answer how it attempts to address or to solve those problems. So the key drivers of economic exclusion that we identify in that document is, first and foremost, obviously an incapable state. That means that government does not have the capacity to deliver on the kind of socioeconomic responses this country so desperately needs. We also look at the challenge of unemployment, of poor educational outcomes, of a disastrous health system, which we've obviously seen has not been able to cope as well with the COVID pandemic, of issues such as people who live far away from centers of economic activity and how that keeps people locked out of the formal economy. We look at really the breakdown of the South African family and how that migratory system of labor still persists in modern day South Africa. And so all of these challenges are really what combined together work together to keep people trapped in a cycle of poverty and deprivation. And so if we want to essentially extract people from that cycle of deprivation, we have to address all of these holistic factors which work together to keep people trapped and excluded from the economy. And so those are essentially the areas that our proposals look to address. And as I think Helen, you already did point out that this policy was passed then on Sunday, overwhelming support from the delegates who were present. And we hope that it really draws a line in the sand and it sets a new direction for South Africa, where we are not forced into this false binary option of choosing between non-racialism or redress. We've actually gone an ambitious and imaginative route of saying we can have a policy that does both. I think I'll leave it there and allow anything else to come up through the questions, I think, on those policies.
Colleagues, I'll just take you through our timelines in terms of our Federal Congress. I'm going to start from today, which is the 7th of September. And let me start by saying happy birthday to Gwen. It is actually her birthday as well. And say today, in terms of building up towards our Federal Congress, is the final date for the submission of our AGM packs. It's also the date for internal verification process of branch AGMs and call for nominations. The 18th of September will be the final date of branch audits by the federal auditor. The 21st to the 27th, we look at the Constitutional Review Committee final review. And then the 23rd of September, the first draft voters' roll will be submitted to provinces for auditing and corrections. And then the 29th is sign off of constitutional amendments. The 30th of September, we distribute a circular of draft constitutional amendments to all delegates. And then on the same day, final submissions and amendments to the voters' roll. The 1st of October, our provincial voters' roll submitted to provinces will be signed off. And then the 10th of October, we certify the voters' roll. Then the 10th of October, nominations will then close. 12th of October, internal verification of candidates and nominations takes place. The 13th of October, we announce all candidates. And then the 30th of October, we then go into our Federal Congress. And that is probably the highlight of the year for the DA. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Solly, who will then chair the Q&A. Thank you very much. Over to you, Solly.
Thanks, Refilwe, and welcome to our media colleagues. So just for the purposes of the presser, you can go into the participants icon and press the raise hand function when you want to raise a question. I will take 3 rounds of questions, 3 hands per round, and then we'll take the responses in totality, then proceed to the next round. Just so that we play open with everyone, we've got this Zoom facility until 12. That is why both Gwen and Helen have been brief in their comments so that we can allow for the questions. So in that order, I will be going through the function to see who have raised their hands. The first 3 hands I see are Neo Mutloung, Zianda Ngobo, and Govan. So in that order, we'll start with Neo, then go to Zianda, and finish off with Govan.
Hi, it's Neo here from Jacaranda FM. Gwen, there are a lot of reports, I think you saw Sunday's opinion pieces with some arguing that the DA is continuing with its colorblind policies, and it's for that reason that we might see a lot of black leaders in the party moving out because of this policy. Would you like to react? Would you please react to that? Is the DA playing colorblind with this new economic policy?
Thanks, Neo. Can we go to Zianda?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's Zianda Ngobo from Newsroom Africa. I've got a couple of questions. The first, I'd actually like to direct to the Federal Chair, Helen Zille, and to respond to the fact that there was an outcry from delegates about the way the conference was being held, and that it was a mere rubber stamping exercise of policies that they actually had no way to contribute towards. What is your response to that? And it's linked to my next question, which is similar to Neo's. If the DA could please clarify why the charges against leaders at the moment coincidentally happen to be against the black leaders of the party who would have previously supported Musima Imane. We saw Pumzile Van Dam saying that she hasn't formally been told by the party about her charges. And then just lastly, regarding the economic justice, I mean, some analysts, including Professor Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance, has raised the issue of the fact that, you know, while on the one hand you do have your clause on diversity and your many drivers of inequality in the country, at the end of the day, they are also aligned to the color of one's skin. So how are you going to treat everyone equally when they don't have the same economic legacies? Thank you.
Thanks, Zianda. And the final question for this round goes to Govan.
Thank you so much. It's Govan Whittles here from ENCA. Could I please get a response from Helen Zille on this one? Ma'am, could you break down or elaborate the rejection of race, but the recognition of racism? And just give us an idea on how the DA believes the policy that you've adopted at this meeting will affect your performance in the 2021 local government elections. Mike Moriarty on record saying that your internal polls are showing that the direction you're taking could lead to some growth. And then I have a question regarding the economic justice. Does the DA have any policies that seek to rectify specifically the inequality that was created by apartheid? Or does it not believe that a specific policy to deal with apartheid inequality is required? And then finally, Ms. Zille, on the point on the finances of the Democratic Alliance, you're going into a leadership election at the end of the year, and the ANC is caught in a quagmire of not being able to reveal who funded the individual campaigns of the candidates who contested elections. Did you or will you call on your candidates to disclose where they raised their funding? And was there any policy finalized during the conference in this regard? Thank you.
Thanks very much, colleagues. I'll now hand over to both Gwen and Helen for the responses.
Should I start? The first question that was directed at me was on color blindness. It's interesting because color blindness to me is obviously, not assuming from somebody's race their internal beliefs or their, so you don't from somebody's race assume their religion, their beliefs, their values, their interests, their position on an issue, that their skin color will not tell you those things about a person. What this policy focuses on is the issue of economic exclusion and how we approach that. So, to the level that this policy talks about race, it absolutely recognizes the system that apartheid was based on. And this is where sometimes it's frustrating because I get a sense that, the policy wasn't read. So if you read the policy, you won't ask, do you recognize that the system, for example, of apartheid was based on race? Because you would have that answer in the policy. The policy begins by saying that we come from an apartheid past based on racial segregation, and that therefore people were excluded from the economy on the basis of their race. The question that we find ourselves now, over 25 years after apartheid, is asking, why are so many people still excluded from the economy? So we've gained political freedom, but we don't have broad economic inclusion of people in the economy. And the question is, how will we achieve that? So we have to understand what is driving that economic exclusion, and we set out the various factors, not from our own kind of thumb-sucking exercise, from the economic literature about what drives economic inequality. And then we provide the answers systematically for dealing with all of those drivers of economic exclusion. So that's how the policy approaches the issue of redress, how race is identified within that policy as being the basis of that apartheid system. But obviously the policy is talking about, well, now how do we address the various drivers of exclusion that, yes, were caused by apartheid, have been perpetuated or not been resolved in the last 25 years by the current government? How do we deal with these issues? And we provide then the solutions. Helen, some of the other questions that I could pick up on were directed specifically to you, but they are policy ones. So maybe I'll let you go first, and then I'll see where maybe to pick up from there, since they were directed to yourself.
Well, if you don't mind, let me answer the issue on the finances, Helen.
Yeah, sure.
On our code of conduct for contesting internal elections was very clear. Every single candidate who puts themselves out for contesting has to disclose every single cent that they fundraise for the internal election. We have it goes to the presiding officer of the Congress. Thank you very much. To you, Helen.
Thank you very much for taking those questions. I will leave the policy questions to Gwen. I will just answer the process questions. And Zianda asked whether this wasn't just a rubber stamping exercise, and the delegates complained that they didn't have the opportunity to comment. Well, I can't imagine that that is even possible, with all honesty, because there has never been such an inclusive policy process in the Democratic Alliance, ever. We held the policy conference under clause 6.2.6.6 of our Constitution, and we were going to hold it in April, but because of COVID, we couldn't. and we hadn't yet successfully made a complete transition to digital platforms as we now have made. So it took us some time to organize all of our systems and processes to go digital, which we managed to do, and that enabled us to hold our conference over this weekend digitally. But in all that time, or most of that time, the policies that we discussed over the weekend have been on our policy portal. Gwen and Gwenya also, in addition to that, went round to every provincial council when she could still travel, or alternatively, held those discussions virtually with every provincial council in the country. So we had all the policy documents on the policy portal. We received scores and scores, probably hundreds of comments actually. When compiled all of the criticisms and questions and critiques in a very fat document, from which he had to exclude all the positive comments, otherwise it would have been very difficult to deal with. The document would have been so big. That document was also circulated to all delegates. Furthermore, every single delegate could make a proposed amendment to any of the policies, and we advertised the deadline for amendments as the 16th of August, and we reopened the window for amendments just this past week when some people said they'd missed the deadline and still wanted to propose amendments. So the extraordinary thing is that never before has a process been so inclusive in the Democratic Alliance, and never before have people had such an enormous opportunity to comment, to participate, to debate, to propose amendments, and to vote on crucial issues. So I'd be very, very surprised if anybody in the Democratic Alliance saw this as a rubber stamping exercise. It was, in fact, the dead opposite. Then, Governor Whittle's question, I do think, is a question that should go to Gwen because it's drawn directly from her policy. The rejection of race, but the recognition that racism does exist. Gwen dealt with it in detail at the conference. She used a very good analogy, and I think I should give her the opportunity to do that now.
Right, so that question, I believe, is how do you deal with racism if you recognize that race itself doesn't exist? And essentially, I mean, this was obviously an important question to answer, but it's important to recognize that racism and race itself need not be linked. So race is recognized as a false concept, but just because the belief in race is false doesn't mean that people can't do very terrible things on the basis of that false belief. So throughout history, people have done atrocious things on the basis of false beliefs. Something doesn't need to be real for people to act on it. So the Holocaust was based on false beliefs about Jewish people. That didn't mean those beliefs were real. And so anti-Semitism, as an example, can very much be real without the things that make up Semitism to be, without them being necessarily real. So similarly, I think, in South Africa, just this particular point came up to me, quite strongly recently, because I was reading a book, which I don't want to go too much detail of, but just reading about the continued witch burnings in South Africa, which is absolutely horrific, when you think that in a modern 21st century that this is still occurring. But I just found that such a relevant example because we very much should talk more about this issue, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that the beliefs some communities have about witches are true just because witch burnings are true. So similarly, race doesn't have to be true for people to do absolutely horrendous things on the basis of their false belief in race. So people believe false things about each other based on people's skin color or whatever it is in your mind that race constitutes of. It doesn't make it real just because people do bad things on that basis. So we will always fight the horrible things that people do on the basis of the false belief in race. So I think that's really how to answer why you don't need race to be true or racism to be true. And racism must continue to be fought And actually anti-racism and fighting racism is very much part of the agenda of non-racialism. But to pick up on the other policy questions was that there was a question of, electoral prospects. And I think if I can touch on that just from a policy perspective to say that that is not how one fundamentally approaches the task of policymaking. You don't confront a problem and say, okay, we have an issue with unemployment, and then approach the problem based on what the majoritarian belief in that solution is. If you wanted to establish a political party based on simply what will win votes, then that's easy. You conduct a referendum on every single issue, the death penalty, gay marriage, think of all the controversial binary issues in South Africa that divide us, and do a survey on them. Whatever the majority wants, make that all the positions of your party. So the majority want the death penalty, tick. It means our policy is the death penalty. The majority are anti-gay marriage, tick, that's the position. I mean, that's really what you're asking when you say, will this be a vote-winning policy, is have we approached policy making from what is popular? And the answer is no, that is not how we approach policy. We approach policy based on our values and principles, which is what we help to recommit ourselves to on Saturday. And we also approach it based on evidence, which is also one of our principles. We say that we believe in evidence-based decision-making. So it is the combination of principle and evidence which we believe gives rise to the best kind of policy outcomes. Then, of course, once you've got a good policy that you think addresses the issue well, based on the evidence and based on your principles, then you can begin the task of saying, okay, how do we communicate this? But you have to start first with what is the best solution. And then you can consider, well, how do we go about the difficult task of talking to people about this? And I think that we mustn't undersell or short sell South Africans. People do have the capacity to listen, to potentially be persuaded by good argument. And I will never run away from the task of persuading and talking to people just because that is not their initial position. There'll be no point in debate if all we defer to are people's initial positions. People can be persuaded. We can have a conversation with South Africans and explain to them why we've taken the approach that we have. So I don't know if this one policy is a vote-winning policy. I don't think South Africans even vote that way. I don't think they vote, well, I don't think many have their primaries in as policies. I would love it if that were the case, but I think policies are a part of it. And I certainly don't think one policy will determine how people vote, but it's part of the conversation which we are going to have now and in the future. I think there was a bit of a long one, but I just do think some of these are quite important to address comprehensively. Actually, the last one is quite quick. It said, is there any policy to deal with apartheid inequality? And I'm really not being facetious, but the answer is short. Yes, there is a policy to deal with apartheid inequality. It's the one we passed on Sunday, and the details of how we plan to address all of those inequalities are in that policy document.
Thanks, Gwen and Helen. I think there is an important additional point I want to make for the process that was undertaken. And I think it's because many people often not clear on the structures of the party. The policy unit team went to consultations with the provincial councils of 7 of the 9 provinces. 2 of those were done virtually. And these structures represent the regional and branch leadership in each of those provinces. Some of the members of those provincial councils are delegates to Federal Council, and some of them are members of the shadow cabinet. So those individuals would have interacted with the draft policy proposals on more than one occasion. So by the time that the policy conference took place over the last 2 days, they were seeing those documents probably for the 3rd time or the 4th time, and have had opportunities to even make submissions to the policy unit in the lead up to the timeline that was articulated. So when we talk about the inclusive nature of that process, it is particularly to refer to those. So for the second round, I see there are lots of hands popping up now. So for the second round, I will take Busi, I will take Claudie and Marian. We will take these ones now, and the others I'll take for the second round because I see there were more than 3 hands for this. So in that order, Busi, Claudie, and Marian.
Thank you very much, Solly. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it's Busi Chimombe from the SABC. Now, you've told us about your process, what happened in terms of getting consultations from the different delegates. But, you know, because we were not allowed into your conference, can you give us some kind of insight into what were some of the amendments that actually came up? And what were some of the issues, particularly with regards to yesterday's discussions that generated a lot of heated discussion? That's my first question. The second one is that one of the values and principles you have has got to do with fairness within the party. And I'd like to know if that also relates to your internal processes, because it appears as if there are a lot of your members and leaders who are facing disciplinary charges. Does that worry you at some point? It seems like in some cases, some of the charges are quite frivolous.
Thanks,
Thank
Busi.
you.
Can we go to Claudie?
Hi guys, it's Claudia from Business Day here. I just wanted to find out firstly whether, Helen or Gwen, if you can answer this please, whether you were happy with the level of debate on the policies and on the principles specifically. And then Gwen, just in terms of where you said now that when you write your policies, it's not a case of that you go out that this will be a vote winner, right? So would this be a sacrifice you're willing to make if you do lose votes on the basis of these policy discussions? As a result of, would it be worth it to make these type of sacrifices if you do in the end up losing votes for this, for the sake of principle? Thank you.
Thanks, Claudie. And the last one for this round, Marion.
I hope you can hear me all right. It's Marianne Merton from the Daily Maverick. Clearly, this policy conference has now done away with redress as a proxy for race, which was the position adopted in 2013. You have a whole range of indicators of inequality and what needs to be done, be that malnutrition or, you know, schooling, whatever. But then when it comes to seeing race, you suddenly go blind, even though if you look at any of the official indicators, be that Stats SA, all sorts of other academic and other research institutes continuously highlight the correlation of race and inequality. How would you take this position to outside of the DA? What would be your arguments? How would you defend it? Because I would think that for many people, the DA and its color blindness and its race blindness does come at a risk of making the DA a laughing stock. On the other question, I would like some comments, possibly from Gwen Ngwenya or Helen Zille. What is the DA position on Black Lives Matter? Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. Gwen and Helen, can we deal with these questions for this round?
Do you want?
Would you like to go first, Gwen? Or shall I deal with points first? It's fine, I don't mind.
Okay, I can go first. So I'm just going to try to sift out some of the policy ones. So there's a question about, is it worth to lose votes for the sake of principle? I mean, take that for an example. If it was a policy on the death penalty, of course, it's absolutely worth losing votes on the basis of principle. But the question is, will we lose votes on the basis of principle? I mean, I don't think that this question gets asked almost as though the case has been established that a large group of South Africans are hostile to this policy, and nobody has made that case at all. In fact, it's not just our own research. You look at, I think a more recent one that I saw was the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, but it also looked at attitudes towards using race in policy, and also looked at people's feelings towards BE. And it showed most people do not feel that current empowerment policies have worked for them. These are current empowerment policies that continue to use apartheid race classification in them. Most South Africans don't feel those policies have benefited them. And furthermore, when asked whether they support policies that would benefit all South Africans and also uplift the poor. Many people agree with this. So it's almost as though we have to argue against a straw man. There is no report, nothing put in front of me to say, or us to put in front and say, this is the feeling of, the majority of South Africans. The majority of South Africans feel that we have to make a choice between non-racialism, as you describe it, and redress, whereas I don't see that binary at all. Instead, I hear that many South Africans are committed to non-racialism in the sense that they recognize that race classification itself is a legacy of apartheid. Many South Africans would like to move away from all of these legacies of apartheid, and they would like to be included in the economy. There's just zero evidence to say that South Africans would not support a policy that both is non-racial and achieves economic exclusion. And I keep being forced into this binary where the assumption is that it is not going to address the material conditions of South Africans, but it will. I mean, that's precisely what the policy addresses. So I think we can go around in circles on that, but I think that one, there is no evidence. So it's, I won't keep on trying to fight a straw man with no evidence has been presented that South Africans would not be welcoming to a policy that achieves both redress and non-racialism. But I also think it's partly covered by the response I gave earlier about electoral prospects to say, even if there was this binary choice to be made between a sound policy and electoral prospects, one has to consider the fact that you don't approach policy in that way. You have to, if you at least are a person of integrity, to first start off with what is a good solution, and then you secondly consider what is expedient. And I think good solutions can be communicated well, and we will continue, to do that. This question of proxy is obviously, I don't know whether to even call it an interesting one. I don't know who came up with it. Let's start it this way. I don't know at which point in time who came up with this question of defining the economic exclusion as a debate between whether race is a proxy for disadvantage or not. I mean, that is not really the main question to be answered when you are asking, how do we deal with economic exclusion? No paper that I have seen that addresses the issue of inequality solved by saying, now let's discuss whether race is a proxy for disadvantage or not. And let me explain why. Is that typically proxies are used when, and some of you may have heard this before from me, is that you use a proxy when the thing you're trying to achieve is fairly intangible. So there is a field of economics and other social scientists who, for example, might want to ensure that policies give rise to happiness in society. And there's this idea that we should try and aim to have happier society. So let's say you wanted to achieve that as a government, say, a happier society. Now, happiness doesn't have a unit, it's not like kilometers walked or a monetary, there's no unit for happiness. So because happiness is intangible, you then might need a proxy. So you might have to have a conversation about, well, what is a good proxy for happiness? Maybe we can measure happiness by measuring how many people have shelter. Maybe we can measure happiness by how many times somebody goes to the picnic or to the park every week and has a picnic. I don't know how you measure happiness, but you can have a debate about what is a proxy that we can use to measure happiness. But here we are dealing with economic exclusion, inequality. There are a range of wealthy indicators about how we measure inequality. So there's income inequality, wealth inequality. We can look at spatial dynamics. We can look at inequalities in healthcare, so access, quality, etc. There are various indicators that tell us in really extraordinary detail about what it means to suffer from inequality in this country. So the question really isn't about whether race is or isn't a proxy. Yes, you could use it. You could say that because the majority of South Africans who are poor are also Black, that race is a proxy for disadvantage. If you wanted to use it as a proxy, you can use it as a proxy. The question is not whether you can, it's whether you should. So we can use race, but if you don't have to, why would you use it? So we have really detailed indicators. I want to know more from a policy-making perspective. I want to know more than just, oh, you are Black and poor. I want to know more about you than your race. I want to know, oh, in this condition, people live very far away from areas of work. I want to know what kind of healthcare services you have access to. I want to know whether you might suffer from malnutrition. We want to know whether you have a job or not. So, I hope that explains in detail why that proxy of race, whilst one can use it, it doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the material conditions that people experience. And if you want to address those material conditions, you need to know more about them than their race. And those are the actual conditions that you need to address. So I think we need to move away from really this intellectualized, abstract debate about whether race is a proxy or not, because it doesn't get us down to the issues that people face on the ground and that we need to address in order to ensure more economic inclusion.
Thank you very much. I'll answer Busi's question. I would just add to what Gwen's exposition, that if you only use race and not all of the issues that Gwen has mentioned, which give you the real indicators of exclusion, if you only use race, you end up with Jacob Zuma, for example, saying he was only applying BBBEE when he ensured that all of his network got tenders and contracts and got into top positions so they could manipulate systems and create looting channels from the state. He was using race, and that's why he keeps on saying he was only applying BEE. And if you only use race, you can argue that. The critical thing is you've got to use the real indicators of exclusion, which are certainly not only defined by race, and if you only use race, it has been used certainly by the ANC as a license to loot. Let me come to the process points. My job in the DA is to make sure that processes are fair and that everybody is treated fairly and properly under our Constitution. And I don't know where the myth arises from that 6 out of 9 provincial leaders are facing charges at the moment. That is not true. One provincial leader, as far as I understand it, from the Federal Legal Commission, and I don't interfere in their work at all, it's the DA's judiciary. One provincial leader is facing charges, and that person happens to be the one provincial leader who isn't black. That is apart from John Moody, who was facing charges, some of the most serious charges that have ever come before the Federal Legal Commission, backed by strong evidence, including tape recordings and documents. And he decided to leave and turn it into a race issue. So all of the issues are fair, and often complaints are made in political parties. They're made all the time in every political party. But there isn't a political party that deals with them more fairly than the DA. That's why when people make complaints against others, there's a 2-stage process. Firstly, the Federal Legal Commission does an investigation to see whether the complaint has merit and whether there is any substance to it. That is how they throw out the frivolous cases. And that is how we can determine in the Federal Executive when cases are frivolous or not. And everybody is treated equally before the processes in the DA, and we certainly strive to be as fair as it is humanly possible to be. I think I've answered my question.
Thanks, Helen. Gwen, do you want to come back on an outstanding question?
I think there was, lastly, that question about Black Lives Matter. I think that was well dealt with by our spokespersons in Parliament when the matter arose. I suppose maybe very succinctly, because I know that I can be long in some of my responses, I can just say that I think we would distinguish between sort of the capitalized Black Lives Matter, so the organization and the various kind of, gestures that have come to be associated with that particular movement, and the statement Black Lives Matter. So let's say there wasn't the organization and somebody asked, do Black Lives Matter? I mean, of course, what kind of question is that anyway? Of course, Black Lives Matter. But I think sometimes when people ask that question, it's usually in response to an event that has happened. So maybe somewhere somebody has refused to raise a fist or to kneel or to do some other kind of formative action that is associated with the global movement started by that particular organization. And it's there that we say, no, we don't think that people should be forced into particular actions to demonstrate their allegiance or their support, perhaps is a better word, of a particular cause. So if somebody came up to me and said, you know, are you in support of ending gender-based violence? I'd say, of course I'm in support of ending gender-based violence. If they said, well, in order to show that here's a star, you must start wearing the star to show your support of ending gender-based violence, and I say no, and then on that basis they decide to say, well, you will not wear the star, so therefore you are clearly not in support of ending gender-based violence. I mean, that's preposterous. And that's sometimes the situation politically that people are finding themselves in, that they are judged to be in support or not in support of a particular ideal because they've refused to do some other kind of performative action, which a group who has decided is necessary in order to show that you support that ideal. And I think that is obviously wrong. And we will not be, you know, encouraging people to, no, not just encouraging. So I think in many cases, they're not just simply encouraged. We will not be forcing people to undertake any kind of performative action in order to illustrate or demonstrate their support of any ideal.
Cool, thanks, Gwen. For the final round, we will start with Tidi, proceed to Yan, and given that there are no other hands, I'll give a follow-up to Govan, and then we will wrap it up from there. So in that order, Tidi, Yan, and Govan.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Tidi Madia from News 24. Firstly, Gwen, happy birthday. Gwen, I hear you talking about how we're forcing you into this binary conversation around the votes. And I'm not sure if this is a question or comment that I'm asking you to react to, but what necessitated this particular moment for the DA is the review that took place last week following a dismal performance at the election. So shouldn't it matter from that perspective? That's the first thing. Secondly, I think these are for Helen. So Musi Maimane was speaking a short while ago, saying that you can't have redress without recognizing race. In fact, he went as far back as when he was elected as federal leader, and how he said, you know, if you can't see that I'm a black man, you can't see me. Then he went on to explain how it is in this that resulted in his departure from the DA, because there couldn't be an agreement on the direction. And I'm assuming you might have seen Adrian Basama editor's opinion piece about how between you, Helen, and John Steenhuisen, you're driving the DA back to being, you know, DP under Tony Leon. In the same breath, John Moody last week spoke about a similar thing, that there's this need to try and create this narrow focus as far as the party is concerned, and not grow anywhere beyond 20% of the voters' share. And then my last one is just a quick comment around processes. I know there were hiccups during the conference with regards to the non-voting delegates. I know it was minor, had no real impact. And I know that the checks and balances picked up on it, but do you have any concerns around what happens next month, even though you're using a different model? Are there plans to now tighten it to make sure that things like this, when non-voting delegates make a mistake and vote, won't happen? Thank you.
Thanks, Tidi. Next one is Yan.
Thank you, Jan and Hubert for Marula Media. Mine is a simple mathematical question. I don't quite get how many voting delegates there were at this Congress exactly, because we were reduced, of course, by the fact that we were not allowed to follow this Congress, to getting information from it and screenshots and the like. And it seems as though if there were 200 voting delegates, then the percentage poll of voting must have been pretty low, because some of those raw numbers coming in favor of or against the policies seem to be extremely low. What happened to the people who did not vote, if there were 200? And what is an overwhelming majority precisely? What are the numbers, not your impression of the numbers, the exact numbers by which all of these issues were passed or not passed? Thank you.
Thanks, Yan. And Govan, for your follow-up.
Thank you so much. It's Govan Whittles here again from ENCA. Ms. Zille, could you please respond to the reports that there is widespread discontent and even resentment brewing among Black members and leaders of the Democratic Alliance, not because of the departure of some of the Black leaders, but because of these disciplinary charges that were instituted against some of the other Black leaders in the party? And are you bracing for another raft of resignations by key Black leaders? And then I would like to find out, Ms. Zille, do you regret the departure of Black leaders such as Mashaba and Musi Maimane and John Moody, or do you think the DA is better off without them? And then, you know, Ms. Zille, you are accused of being behind the purging yourself. I'd like to get your direct response to that, please. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. And we'll now proceed to the responses.
I would love to respond to the questions, and we've got very little time. Are they going to throw us off this platform at 12 sharp? Because let me get on very quickly. Let me first answer Tsidi's question about the hiccups. We use different voting platforms for different systems. Now, in a policy conference, we never ever have secret ballots. In a policy conference, we usually wave around physically either a green card or a red card in a big hall where everyone can see how we are voting, and it's counted physically. Here we had a Zoom platform which gives you a poll vote, and in fact, it was, to all intents and purposes.
Right, folks, we've fast run out of time. That was Helen Zille there. Basically, race, indicators of exclusion, economic justice, etc. Hot topics at the DA's briefing following their policy conference at the weekend. As I said, we've run out of time, but you'll hear much more on this and other stories on On Point. The news continues. I want to hand it over to the On Point team. Have yourself a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.